I've mentioned undead elementals a couple times already, so I figured it would be interesting to make a video showing off 4 of them that I concocted for Esper's Emporium of Esoterica. As I've said previously, both the undead and the elemental creature types have a lot to offer. It seems there are endless varieties of both of these creature types. To this point, I discovered through the process of developing my book that certain creature types are easier to make new monsters from, and others are more difficult. Some are simply more limited in scope, like oozes are always slimy blob things, and giants are always big hulking things, and celestials are always sacred things with connections to upper planes. But undead are more diverse. They can take any natural thing and twist it into a necromantic version of its former self. And elementals can take any natural thing and focus onto its most primal essence, even mixing and matching base substances in a sort of alchemical chimera. So it's no surprise that if we combine the depth of both undead and elementals, the results are fascinating. Dreadful, but fascinating. What I did with these creatures here is I took inspiration from the 4 base classical elements, air, fire, earth, and water, then mixed them with ghoulish themes and gave them names that are plays on words. Let's go ahead and dive into them. I'll cover their stats and their lore and explain a bit of my thought process behind them.
Blightening.
A dark cloud jaunts through the air. Storms ripple from its wraith face, and black lightning crackles about it. First up is the Blightening. The initial inspiration that came to me was an image in my mind of a terrifying storm cloud that spit bolts of black lightning, like a negative or a necromantic inverse of natural lightning. It turned out to be a little bit difficult to capture that in the artwork, but in the description I think I did it justice. So the name obviously plays off of the words blight and lightning. Mechanically speaking, it has some pretty interesting things happening. It's a huge undead creature with a neutral evil alignment. I did the same with all of these undead elementals. I figured they'd probably be neutral on the law chaos spectrum. That's a pretty typical alignment for elementals, as they're generally more associated with nature and natural forces and primordial essences, as opposed to ideals and philosophies and thoughts and opinions. Evil though, because after all, it is a corrupt undead thing. It's a very fast creature. It flies extremely fast. It's very dexterous, though it doesn't have any ground speed. Basically what you're going to see with its hit points and its damage resistances and all of its base traits is that it does resemble an air elemental quite a bit. It has a feature called lightning form, which, like elementals, specifies how it can squeeze through very narrow little cracks, and as well if creatures touch it or go into its space, or even if it goes into a creature's space, it deals lightning damage. It's an automatic source of lightning damage, as just merely touching the thing or being surrounded by it is constantly shocking you. It also has death bursts, such that when it dies, it explodes in a burst of negative energy that deals necrotic damage. It has 2 actions, an at-will action called Dark Bolt, where it releases a bolt of black lightning in a 60-foot line that is 5 feet wide. Creatures in the line's area have to make a dexterity saving throw, and if a creature is relying solely on dark vision, then it has disadvantage on the save. In other words, you're in pure blackness, and more pure blackness is what is trying to shock you. The creature takes lightning damage on a failed save, or half damage on a successful one. In addition, a creature that fails the save loses its flying speed and falls if it's flying. If it has hover, it will land safely. At the end of each of its turns, a creature can try to regain its flying speed by succeeding on a Constitution saving throw. This expresses the theme or the dynamic that a lot of undead creatures have, in which they drain life or energy or qualities from the living, qualities that are associated with the undead. So in this case, a very fast flying thing that drains flying from creatures. Sort of like what we saw with the Void Wraith in the Undead Elementals video, where it's an undead air elemental that drains air out of people's lungs. It has an additional action that is a recharge of 6 called Spew Blight Storm, in which the blightening exhales out a cloud of enervation in a 60-foot cone. This deals a bunch of necrotic damage and imposes a level of exhaustion, or on a successful con save, a creature in the area takes half damage and no exhaustion. The blightning's origin typically has to do with a creature who wields storm powers or storm magic who becomes corrupt. One of the most exhilarating kinds of power is the ability to command elemental forces, and none is so singularly astonishing as the power of the storm. Tremendous blasts of thunder and devastating surges of lightning. It's incredible. A person who wields such talents thrills at the crackling energy he channels through his own hands, or the bolts of lightning that he calls down. Yet this path has a dark side, which is often overlooked. "I am the mighty one. My foes scatter before me," shouts the storm sorcerer or the tempest warrior. How easily he comes to see himself as always right, and his foes as always wrong. The elemental might invigorating him cannot be a corrupting force. Or can it? What's the difference between a storm rampager and a demon? The distinction between them is pretty hazy. The degree of separation is slim. One of the most devious devices of abyssal corruption is to appear as something natural. Usually neglected by wizard schools and shamanic mentors alike, is the blightening. From time to time, a mortal with storms in his blood becomes blind to his own wicked tendencies. He strays so much from the path of moral vigilance that when he perishes, his blackened soul persists in order to continue wreaking havoc upon others. When the next foul storm rolls in, the blightening descends, screaming and spewing bolts of death. Bonefire. Within the blaze are gathered skeletal warriors, blackened and sinister. They press their assault, with the conflagration surrounding them all the while. Next we have the Bonefire, playing off of the word bonfire, and including its skeletal theme. There are a few creatures in the Emporium that are hordes. This is a sort of new way to do a creature. It takes the idea of a swarm, but instead of a medium swarm composed of tiny creatures, these are huge or gargantuan hordes composed of medium creatures. The other horde creatures in the book are the Host of Angels and the Pernicious Mist. The way that the horde is working here with the Bonefire is that it occupies a 15-foot cube. It can share the space with other creatures, and enemies treat the space as difficult terrain as they have to navigate between all of these different component, medium-sized creatures inside of the horde. It can move through any opening that is large enough to accommodate one of its component medium creatures, and kind of like what we saw with the blightening, since the thing is emitting damaging elemental power right from its body, creatures that touch it or hit it with melee attacks, or creatures that simply go into its space, get burned and take fire damage. In addition, because it's a horde, it can take a reaction every single creature's turn in combat, and you cannot affect it with any kind of effect, whether it's a positive effect or a negative effect, unless it's something that applies to at least half of the Bonefire's space. In other words, if you have a spell that just targets one single creature, it's not really going to work against this entire horde. The exception to this, of course, is damage. You can attack it regularly like you would against any huge-sized creature. It has another trait called Extinguish. If it's submerged or doused with at least 20 gallons of water, it cannot deal any fire damage until the end of its next turn, assuming it ends that turn outside of water. It has Illumination, specifying that it sheds light due to the fire. It has a multi-attack, in which it makes 6 attacks, or 3 if it has 57 hit points or fewer, which is half of its hit points, as typically swarm-type creatures do less damage once their numbers get thinned out. Its attacks include Flaming Slash, which is a basically sword attack that deals slashing damage and fire damage, and flaming arrow, again, shooting an arrow deals the piercing damage and fire damage. A number of the monsters in the Emporium have lore that is actually written from the perspective of a character, or an NPC really, in the fantasy world. In fact, lots of the NPCs that are quoted telling stories and talking about the lore of the creature are actually NPCs from the book itself. This one here is from Biosedulis. I was but a ladling when I first heard the tales of the ruined town, a haunted place of charred husks that were once houses. Long ago, the town had been well and wealthy, profiting from a productive gemstone mine. Then the day came that a greedy warlord arrived with the pyromancer at his side. When his initial offer for a peaceful surrender was refused, the whole town was set ablaze, with its residents barred inside their homes. The excessive cruelty was only surpassed by the excessive use of elemental fire from the mage. A cadre of town warriors suffered more than any, as they had taken refuge within the local fort. While it did allow them a defensible location to mount a semblance of a counterattack, its thick walls meant their fiery fate was all the more drawn out as they slowly cooked to death instead of being quickly scorched or asphyxiated like the other townsfolk. Afterward, while the warlord and his raiders were looting the smoldering remains of the fort, a terrible blaze rose up all around them, as well as the blackened remains of the warriors, fueled beyond death by elemental energy and a hateful urge for revenge. Some claim that this story is apocryphal, but bonfires are very real and every bit as terrifying as they sound. Beings of undeath, as well as elemental fire. They are said to permanently scar the minds of those who survive an encounter with one. One such victim reported to me that her last sensation before losing consciousness was hearing the tortured screams of all those who had burned alive when the bonfire formed. Biosedulis, proprietor of the Bazaar of the Bizarre. It has now been 1 year since I released the Emporium, and what a journey this has been. In celebration of its first anniversary, I've lowered the price of the PDF version, which you can find on my website, esperthebard.com. There's also the hardcover version for those who like physical books. The Emporium is a mixture of both old school and new school styles, and it really offers a ton of content for both players and game masters. Really, I need to make more videos showing off things from it. There is an all-new character class, the Paragon, which is a fated soul from the pages of myth. There are subclasses like the Berserker Barbarian, Majesty Cleric, Gladiator Fighter, and White Lotus Monk, along with Warlock invocations, feats, spells, weapons and armor, magic items, cursed items, GM advice, magic shops, arena combat rules, traps, skill encounters, and a huge bestiary of over 170 monsters and NPCs. I really went overboard and overly ambitious with this project, but hey, it resulted in a massive volume to last for a long, long time to come. I've also put out an errata PDF that includes updates and clarifications for things in the Emporium. You can find that in the free content section on my website. The links are all down below in the video description. Come check out Esper's Emporium of Esoterica. You will discover a tome that is bursting full of inspiration. Sepulterra. The ground heaves, and up rises a giant composed of soil, stone, tombs, and corpses. Rising up from the graveyard, literally the graveyard, is the Sepulterra, whose name is inspired by two Portuguese words, sepultura, meaning tomb, and terra, meaning earth. The Sepulterra has the highest armor class and hit points of all the undead elementals, befitting of an earth undead elemental, though it's not as fast as the other ones. It does have a burrowing speed, though. It has a passive feature called Corrupt Ground, and all the ground within 10 feet of the sepulterra deals necrotic damage to creatures that start their turn in contact with the ground or enters that ground for the first time on a turn. For its actions, it has a multi-attack of 2 slams that deal both bludgeoning and necrotic damage. It has an entomb feature in which it attempts to entomb a medium or smaller creature within itself. The creature has to make a strength saving throw, and on a failure, it takes bludgeoning damage and gets trapped inside the sepulterra, where it's stuck in this tomb, it's blinded and restrained and can't breathe, and is taking ongoing necrotic damage, though it does get total cover from anything outside the sepulterra. And once per day, it can release Undead, in which it disgorges 4 undead allies in any combination of zombies, skeletons, or crawling claws. The Sepulterra lore tells a curious and grisly tale. The wizard Sahir Molomatma once ruled a city-state that included a sizable necropolis. He was most protective of this site and bound earth elementals to guard it from thieves, or worse yet, crusaders who sought to hallow the ground. During his necromantic experimentations, Sahir inadvertently transformed one of the elementals into an undead. Bound to the necropolis as it was, the elemental fused with the desecrated ground, the tombs, and a variety of the corpses there. Sahir eventually met his demise at the hands of the zealots from a rival faction, the Anointed Sons, but not before he had passed on to others the dark knowledge of creating sepulterras. Other scholars of Esoterica believe that Sahir Molomatma did not actually create the first sepulterra, but rather it is a phenomenon that can occur when excessive necromantic rites take place at a cemetery, saturating the ground itself with fell magic. Sahir, they say, only codified the process after observing it happen spontaneously. It's debatable which is actually true, what is the actual origin of the sepulterra, but what is known is that a few days after Sahir's death, a band of reavers came at night with a heavy wagon. Upon arriving at the outskirts of the city, they learned that Sahir had been deposed. They immediately turned away. City soldiers followed their trail and found them desperately burying fresh corpses in shallow graves. Most of the reavers fought to the death, but their youngest member surrendered. He confessed that Sahir had set them to the grisly task of slaying the folk of a nearby village, promising rich payment in exchange for the bodies. The young man broke down in madness at having slaughtered so many, all for nothing.
Shipwretch.
A dead face appears through the chunks of debris floating in the water, pale, wrinkled, and barnacle-ridden. Last, but certainly not least, is the shipwretch, a wretch of a shipwreck that serves as the water-themed undead elemental in the book. This monster is slow on land, but pretty fast in the water, and while it is lying there motionless, it is indistinguishable from normal wreckage due to its false appearance feature. It also has a feature called Flotsam, in which water within 30 feet of the shipwretch is difficult terrain. The Flotsam provides half cover, except against attacks made within 5 feet of a target. The shipwretch itself is unaffected by its own Flotsam. It has a multi-attack action in which it uses rope and makes 2 slam attacks. The slams are pretty standard, dealing a good amount of bludgeoning damage. The rope allows the shipwretch to target a medium or smaller creature within 60 feet. The target has to succeed on a dexterity saving throw or get pulled 30 feet closer to the shipwretch and be restrained. The shipwretch can pull the restrained target up to 30 additional feet when it uses rope again, though it can only have 1 creature restrained by the rope at a time. It has a reaction called Wood Ward. When the shipwretch gets hit by an enemy weapon, it can roll 2d10 plus 5, reducing the enemy attack by that amount. And if that reduces the enemy's weapon damage down to 0, the weapon actually gets stuck onto the shipwretch itself. The item can then only be pulled off and retrieved as an action by the enemy succeeding on a strength athletics contest against the shipwretch. The lore of the shipwretch has a nautical and piratical theme, though with some gruesome twists on it. The last thing pirates are known for is virtue. It comes as no shock that shipwrecks in which many nefarious sailors perish can spawn undead. This fetid brute is composed of broken planks, rusted metal, tangled rigging, and drowned flesh, complete with barnacles and seaweed garnishing it. Some claim these horrors are shipwreck golems created by necromancers. Others say they are undead shipwreck elementals. In order to lure victims, a shipwretch will scribble out treasure maps and send them floating to shore in bottles or even tucked in corpses' pockets. These so-called lost maps hint at wealth hiding within the sunken vessel, and when treasure hunters come seeking the fortune, they are ambushed. Putting a shipwretch to permanent rest requires more than slaying it in combat. Physical defeat only sends the undead hulk into a dormant, scattered state from which it will eventually return. One must learn who the ship's captain was, seek out his birth house, and have it consecrated by a priest. Having done this, one needs to then take a stone from the house's foundation, locate the shipwretch, and tie the stone to its ropes. Upon doing so, the undead will sink to the bottom of the sea and lie in eternal rest. There you have it, the cycle of 4 undead elementals from the Emporium of Esoterica. I hope they have given you a special kind of inspiration, one that is a rare and little-known intersection of 2 roadways, the rocky trail of elemental might and the shadowy path of undeath. I have a bunch of ideas for videos that I hope to get into in the near future, and I'm also working on a new D&D book that I will have a Kickstarter for hopefully early next year. And also, don't forget to check out Eldritch Castle, an immersive adventure experience here on my channel. It has some fantastic animated visuals by Maximus of the Tower of Tomes. Until we meet again, my brave companions, may your adventures be many.